Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this Historic Towns Trust lecture. I'm Helen Fulton. I'm chairing today from the University of Bristol, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening, who is Sarah Rees-Jones. Sarah is Professor of Medieval History at the University of York, and she's published extensively on the history of York, among other topics. She's a former contributor to the Historic Towns Atlas for the City of York, and she's currently the principal investigator on an AHRC-funded project that's seeking to make the vast administrative archive of the medieval Archbishops of York accessible to the public online. The project is called The Northern Way, the Archbishops of York and the North of England 1304 to 1405. And that's the basis of her paper this evening, which is called A Northern Way, the Archbishops of York and Urban Development in the 14th Century. Thank you very much, Sarah.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you everybody for zooming in this evening. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I hope that everything's functioning as it should do. In the earlier lectures in this series, Keith Lilly introduced you to the work of the UK Historic Towns Trust and its approaches to producing historical maps and atlases of British towns. And in the second and third lectures, Vanessa Harding, Helen Fulton and Giles Darks focused on projects relating to the cities of London and Bristol. All of these are available from the Historic Towns Trust website. But tonight, I'm going to approach this lecture slightly differently by focusing on the development of towns across a region, that is the north of England. My definition of the north is based on the northern province of England, that is the three ecclesiastical dioceses from Nottinghamshire north to the border with Scotland that fell within the jurisdiction of the Archbishops of York rather than the Archbishops of Canterbury. I have chosen this focus as Helen just indicated, to reflect our current funded project at the University of York and the National Archives, through which we're seeking to make the extensive administrative archive of the medieval archbishops available to the public online. However, in a departure from the advertised title for this talk, and indeed the dates of the project, I'm not going to be focusing on the whole of the 14th century, but on a slightly earlier period that runs from about 1100 to 1350. This period was a period of rapid urban development across both the north of England and indeed northwest Europe, and provided the foundations on which archbishops and others built their engagement with local communities in later centuries. It must be said that I somehow have gone forward too many. It must be said that the current published resources of the Historic Towns Trust for the north of England are relatively slight, and we would very much like to increase the number of northern towns in our portfolio. An historical atlas for the City of York was published in 2015, and an historical map for the city of Kingston upon Hull in 2017 to coincide with Hull's year as UK City of Culture. And it's proved very popular. I am very pleased to say that there are now 3 new projects developing in the north that I hope will be published over the next 2 or 3 years. The first is an historical map of the twin towns of Alnwick and Alnwick in Northumberland that should be out later this year. The second is an historical map of Beverley in the East Riding of Yorkshire. And the third is the prospect, we hope, of a historical atlas for the city of Ripon, now in North Yorkshire. We hope that in future further northern towns and cities will join this group, and we're always open to suggestions for new projects from new partners. Today, I'm going to attempt 2 things. First, I'm going to provide a brief overview of the extent of urbanisation in the northern province by the beginning of the 14th century. And second, I'm going to focus in detail on the urban form of a few towns on the estates of the Archbishops of York, as an experimental exercise in comparative morphology, that is, comparing the physical development of individual towns to each other. Now, in preparing the talk, I've drawn very extensively on the work of other scholars on individual towns, archaeologists, cartographers, and historians. For the sake of brevity, I have not fully cited them all in my talk. And it is through adding a comparative element to their fundamental work that I can hope I can suggest some new, if inevitably sometimes speculative, directions for future study. So, part one, urban development by circa 1300. The 2 centuries after the Norman conquest of England was a period of considerable urban growth in both the size and number of towns. And this growth was in line with the rest of England and indeed Europe. Nevertheless, the north was poorer and less developed than the English Midlands and South. A particularly useful benchmark is the year 1334, the year of a national reassessment of taxes due to the Crown, which was used as a basis for taxation for many decades to come. And here on your screen, you can see a map of the 51 wealthiest towns in England, according to that criterion. And you can see that only 8 of them were in the north: York, Newcastle, Beverley, Nottingham, Hull, Scarborough, Pontefract, and Doncaster. However, it has to be admitted that the counties of Cheshire and Durham are missing from this map because they did not contribute to that taxation, and the coverage of Cumbria is weak. So we should probably add Chester, Durham, and either Carlisle or Penrith to this list as well. Still, it's apparent that the north was less urbanised than the south, at least in terms of the relative absence of larger, wealthier urban communities. But of course, not all towns were large towns, and this period saw an immense growth in the smaller market towns that served local populations and were stimulated by new international trades, such as the wool trade. So if we look instead at this map of all those medieval settlements with recorded markets and fairs, a very different picture emerges, and one that does include the counties of Cheshire, Durham, and Cumbria. In total, 249 northern settlements had such markets by 1300. And as you can see here, they were widely distributed across the region, with a particular emphasis on the lowland corridors running north-south and east-west. The map also shows in gold all those market towns, except in Cheshire and County Durham again, that were assessed as contributing £100 or more in 1334. And here you can see the concentration of those wealthier towns along the Great North Road towards Scotland, now more or less the A1, and along the route following Hadrian's Wall between Newcastle and Carlisle. But above all, the wealth of the East Coast and the East Riding of Yorkshire. Indeed, the East Riding of Yorkshire in the Middle Ages was much the wealthiest and most populous region in the north, and contained several of the north's most prosperous towns. There was also a very pronounced hierarchy within these 40 wealthier places. York and Newcastle upon Tyne were dominant. They each owed well over £1,000. Another 8 to 9 places were of middling wealth, but the great majority of these towns were relatively small, owing less than £200. Wealth was not evenly distributed. So this map of markets gives us a fair impression of the true extent of the urbanisation of the north by the 14th century. The majority of these market settlements were either founded or substantially developed and changed over the 12th and 13th centuries as a result of the longer impact of the Norman conquest and of a general increase in population and trade. First, of course, there were numerous new castle towns built by both barons and the crown across the north in the wake of the conquest, as part of the colonisation of that region by the French. In total, around 1/2 of all new castles built by the new nobility or the crown in the 2 centuries after the conquest were built either within existing market towns or led to the creation of new ones. On the left here, you can see an aerial view of the new market town at Richmond by its castle in North Yorkshire, built next to the castle, which was constructed from the 1070s, while on the right is an extract from our exciting new project a draft map from the new Historical Towns Trust project on Alnwick in Northumberland, a market town that grew outside the entrance to a castle that was first constructed around 1100, but considerably enlarged during the wars with Scotland in the 14th century. Urban growth was also encouraged by the foundation of more than 60 new monastic houses across the region. Some of the earliest monastic foundations were located in existing towns and added to their prosperity, such as the Benedictine monasteries established in Durham, Selby, Whitby, and York, which is shown on this map in red. But other new monasteries stimulated the development of new market settlements. In the 12th century, even though new monastic orders such as the Cistercians favoured rural locations for their houses, nevertheless, most of them were in fact established close to market towns, to whose growth they contributed. And some even led to the foundation of new small market settlements at a short distance from the monastery itself. Fountains Abbey, founded in 1132, which you can see here, was a relatively short journey from the established minster town of Ripon, for example, while Ripon Abbey was close to the castle town of Helmsley. In a lesser known example, the settlement of Bainbridge in Upper Wensleydale grew alongside a new abbey of Fours that was built just across the River Ure, shown on the extreme west of this map as a single blue point. But when that abbey relocated downstream to Jervaux in 1156, a new market settlement was built at neighbouring East Witton instead. Even more impressively, a group of monks who had originally settled near the borough of Preston in Lancashire relocated to the remote coastal peninsula of Furness in 1127. Their relocation resulted in the commercial development of that peninsula through the mining and export of iron ore, which for a while made Furness Abbey one of the wealthiest monasteries in England. And it also contributed to the development of the neighbouring small town of Dalton in Furness, then in Lancashire, now, of course, in Cumbria. Another spur to urban development was the expansion of royal authority. Following the Norman conquest, new royal castle towns such as Knaresborough and Scarborough were either established by the Crown or seized and captured from local lords. As royal authority grew, the Crown also extended its authority over the regulation of overseas trade. The creation of a new royal system for the taxation of exports and imports, and the designation of certain head ports as the main places for their collection in the 13th century, in particular encouraged rapid urban growth in Kingston upon Hull, and you can see the historic towns map here for Hull, which the Crown took over from local monastic lords in the 13th century, and indeed at Newcastle upon Tyne, which, as we've already seen, was among the wealthiest towns in the north by 1334. So there is plenty of evidence for new urban growth under both church and lay lords between 1100 and 1300. But finally, and far above all else, there was a grassroots increase in the market economy at all levels of society, as increased population, production, increased inflation, and profits contributed to the growth in the number of small rural markets and smaller towns serving local communities, as well as contributing to the growth of existing towns. Indeed, West Yorkshire is a good example of a region where a general increase in local trade and population sustained urban development in the 12th and 13th centuries. Many of the towns which later grew into industrial giants in the 18th and 19th century, such as Bradford, Leeds, or Sheffield, had their roots in these small towns that developed 700 to 800 years earlier, although only one of these, Sheffield, ranked among the top 40 northern towns by 1334. So hopefully, this brief overview of the urbanisation of the medieval north convinces you that indeed there is plenty of scope for more historic towns, maps and atlases in this region. So many towns here have medieval or even earlier origins. But to go on to part two, my next question is how similar were these towns? I'm now going to focus on towns of just one type, those belonging to the lordship of the Archbishops of York and their urban form in more detail. The Archbishops of York exercised their spiritual jurisdiction across the whole province, but just like any other institution, they also owned real estate in the form of specific manors and other land holdings from which they could draw an income. And these are often referred to as their temporalities or their worldly possessions. By the 14th century, the northern estates of the archbishops were organised into 6 clusters, each centred on a market town. These were Hexham in Northumberland, Ripon, Otley, and Sherburn-in-Elmet in the West Riding of Yorkshire, Beverley in the East Riding, and Southwell in Nottinghamshire. Sorry, I should go back one. I think I might have lost a slide. Here we go. Each was the administrative centre for a local cluster of other manors and even smaller market towns. As you can see here, for example, Beverley was a centre for the administration of estates across East Yorkshire. But for the sake of brevity, I'm going to focus just on the main administrative centres today. The city of York, by the way, does not figure on this list because by the 14th century, most of the Archbishop's estates there had been given away, either to the Dean and Chapter of York Minster or to new monastic houses. The smallest estate in York that remained to the Archbishops was administered from Sherburn-in-Elmet, as were the Archbishops' houses and estates at Bishopsthorpe, Cawood, and Wistow. Sorry, I'm going the wrong direction. The penalty of doing this by Zoom. We'll catch up in a moment. There we go. Of the 6 towns that functioned as administrative centres for the lordships of the archbishops, 4 had a distinctive function as minster towns: Beverley, Ripon, Southwell, and Hexham. The minster towns all originated as part of an episcopal estate that can be traced back in many cases to the 7th century, the very earliest days of the church. In each of them, major minster churches functioned as regional centres for archiepiscopal authority. Hexham Minster, in the north there, developed as a monastic community, but Beverley, Ripon, and Southwell in the blue circles were all served by communities of secular priests known as canons, each of whom lived independently in their own households. The constitutions of these 3 minsters with their chapters of canons was similar to that of the secular chapter at York Minster, the cathedral church, circled here in purple. And over the period 1150 to 1350, they were reformed to be closer to the York model. Successive archbishops were closely engaged in these reforms, suggesting changes to their governing statutes, promoting the cults of local saints associated with each minster church, contributing to the fabric of the minster churches as they were rebuilt, and maintaining or building archiepiscopal palaces in their grounds. Canons appointed to these minsters were often friends of the archbishop and closely engaged in their administrative affairs, both in the diocese and nationally. Because many of them were also not resident, because they were working in Westminster or elsewhere, these minsters also developed colleges of lesser priests, known as vicars choral, who maintained the daily services in each minster church. And again, archbishops were closely involved in these initiatives, often supplying land from their estates for the construction of new residences for them. As a result of all these initiatives, the estates of the archbishops in each minster town were much reduced, as large areas close to the minster churches were transferred to the canons and the vicars choral for the construction of their new residences. And today what I want to suggest is that this variation in the function of these archiepiscopal towns, and even in the constitution of their clerical communities, was reflected more widely in their developing town plans, as they were altered and enlarged between the 12th and the 14th centuries. The minster towns served by the chapters of secular canons, I will argue, developed a distinctive type of urban environment. So, to take each town in turn. In Beverley, the town centre before circa 1100 may have existed just north of the minster of St. John in the triangle between the two converging streets indicated by the green triangle, which I hope you can see on the screen. But by the middle of the 12th century, a new, larger and more rectangular marketplace had been laid out some half a kilometre to the northwest, and a new church dedicated to St Mary founded at its north end to serve the townspeople. To the west of this marketplace, the name of Newbiggin, first recorded in the 13th century, indicates a district of new residential development that was laid out on something like a grid adjacent to this new marketplace. While the area around the minster was part of the estate of the canons, the new marketplace was developed within the lordship of the Archbishops of York. The rectilinear plan of this new market district was very typical of the new style of town planning evident across Western Europe in this period in its regularity, but its date and location raise other questions too. The site takes advantage of natural topography, using a slightly elevated plateau for the new marketplace, and it also reflected the boundaries of units of lordship, being sited within the estates of the archbishops rather than those of the canons, which were located around the minster. However, it is possible to speculate that the design reflected a wider set of concerns about the relationship between the church and the material world. We've already seen how, in the same period, new foundations of Cistercian monasteries contributed to urbanization, but introduced the practice of distance between each religious community and its supporting market town, in the examples of Jervaux and Furness Abbeys, for example. This was but one reflection of a contemporary church-wide concern about the possible corrupting role of material wealth in the path to salvation, and an urgent debate of how the institutional church, the archbishops and so on, should manage their relationship to that wealth without being contaminated by it. Indeed, we know that, as far back as the 9th century, agreements had sometimes been made to divide the jurisdiction of cathedral cities into more sacred and more secular districts. Worcester, Gloucester, York, and possibly London are all examples of this. In York, the city was divided into different territorial units known as shires, some of which were dependent on the lordship of the archbishop on the one hand, and others on the king. You can see on the left here that by 1100 in the city centre, the shire of the archbishop was concentrated around the minster itself. This is a drawing that comes from the Historical Towns Atlas from York. Whereas by contrast, the King's Shire took in the established marketing districts of the pre-conquest city around the shambles and the pavement, as you can see in the larger period map, also from the Historic Towns Atlas on the right. And perhaps I have to click, yes, I do, to bring those green triangles up. In Beverley in the 12th century, no secular lord was involved, but I suggest that the same instinct to separate the commercial and sacred spaces of the town was evident. This interpretation is strengthened when we turn to other minster towns within the archbishop's lordship. So at Ripon, a new marketplace was also inserted into the existing town plan in the 12th century, some 300 metres to the northwest of the older settlement that probably lay near the minster. The new marketplace was a similar rectangular shape and size to that in Beverley, and as in Beverley, it was developed within the lordship of the archbishop. Again, this established a new commercial centre for the town, and one that was inhabited by the majority of Ripon's lay residents by the later Middle Ages, while the canons and vicars of the minster maintained their residences in the streets around the minster church. With these two examples in mind, we can turn to and offer a new interpretation for the minster town of Southwell as another example of such a similar plan. The streets nearest the minster were largely occupied with the houses of the canons and formed a manor known as the prebendage that belonged to their chapter. It included a very small and possibly quite old marketplace to the northwest of the church in Market Street, shown here in green, except it's not It's not showing there in green, so perhaps I've deleted it by mistake. Oh, yes, there you go, shown here in green. Much as in Beverley and Ripon, the original market settlements may have lain immediately next to the church. But to the north of the prebendage was a distinct manor, the burgage, which belonged to the archbishops. This was laid out with narrow burgage plots around a large empty rectangular space, similar in length to the new marketplaces at Beverley and Ripon. The origin of the burgage is unknown. However, all the written evidence that we have concerning the holding of medieval markets and fairs in Southwell comes from charters granting them to the archbishops, not the canons, supporting the speculation that the burgage originated as a new planned marketplace that was intended to be separate from the minster close with its canons' houses, and to fall within the jurisdiction of the archbishops, as the marketplaces did in both Beverley and Ripon. So in all three of the minster towns of Beverley, Ripon and Southwell, therefore, a remarkably similar pattern is suggested of the addition and growth between the 12th and 14th centuries of new market settlements established under the jurisdiction of the archbishops, centred on large rectangular marketplaces and lying at some distance from the original centres of settlement that lay closer to their minster churches and remained in the hands of their minster canons. This bifocal form seems to have reflected an intended separation both in the function and in the jurisdiction of different elements within the townscape. The coincidence in the form of these three archiepiscopal towns becomes more striking when we compare these towns with others elsewhere in England that shared a similar function. Other cities that developed around cathedrals with secular constitutions developed remarkably similar town plans. One compelling example is the town of Salisbury in Wiltshire, where the cathedral was also served by secular canons. The original Norman cathedral was located in a town on a hilltop within a pre-conquest settlement at Old Sarum. But in the early 13th century, a completely new town and cathedral were laid out in the plain to the south of this hill. As in Beverley, Ripon and Southwell, there was a distinct separation between the new cathedral quarter assigned to the chapter of canons to the south and the new commercial district laid out around a rectangular marketplace at the intersection of several long-distance routes. John Hare, indeed, has recently shown that the original marketplace was rectangular and only later enlarged into the wider area that you see on more recent maps. In other cities with secular cathedrals, oops, sorry, that was not intended again. I'm not doing very well with that. There we go. In other cities with secular cathedrals, similar developments are apparent. Examples would include Lichfield in Staffordshire, Hereford, and Lincoln. Striking similarities include not only the introduction of a bifocal settlement, but also the rectangular shape chosen for the new marketplaces, and even their size. The similarities in dimensions are particularly striking in the three minster towns of the Archbishops of York, as this table suggests, where the new markets were all laid out broadly with a ratio of length to width of 3:1. This ratio was, of course, highly significant in the Christian faith, with its belief in a single Godhead existing in three persons. And indeed, we know that the use of such geometric symbolism was a feature of town planning elsewhere in Europe, but I do not think we've yet considered this possibility in Northern England. And it leads us to ask, does all this hint at some uniformity of purpose in their design? We might suggest that the Archbishops of York were not only interested in reinforcing their authority through the institutional structure and worship of their minster churches, but that these ecclesiastical reforms were part and parcel of initiatives that embraced entire townscapes. Much as Maureen Miller has suggested that Italian bishops in this period engaged in urban design as part of the assertion of their authority. Indeed, the distinctive design of these new minster town marketplaces becomes even more notable when we compare them to the design of other new towns founded in this period, even including other towns belonging to the Archbishops of York. So first of all, we can take Hexham, the last minster town, which was also reorganised in the mid-12th century. A new residence for the archbishops was created opposite the Minster Close, which coincided with the precinct of the Priory of St Andrew. A new marketplace was inserted between the two on a site adjacent to a smaller church dedicated to St Mary. This reorganisation differed from those of the other minster towns. The new marketplace was squeezed into a relatively narrow site immediately next to the east end of the minster, between it and the new Archbishop's Hall. The separation between minster and market, achieved in the replanning of the other minster towns, was not achieved here. Perhaps the constraints of the natural topography of the site limited choices, although it seems to be the case that a new precinct wall for the monastery was constructed as part of this reorganisation and went some way to separating the Minster Church and its community of monks from the new marketplace. And indeed, this was perhaps a decisive difference between monastic towns and the towns of minsters served by secular canons. Monasteries occupied well-defined and enclosed sites, often behind perimeter walls that separated them from the secular town beyond, while the houses of secular canons, even if grouped together, occupied unenclosed streets around their mother churches. Two further archiepiscopal towns, Otley and Sherburn-in-Elmet in the West Riding of Yorkshire, were the administrative centres for regional clusters of archiepiscopal estates, and while both had parish churches, neither had religious communities of either monks or canons. Otley's chartered markets and fairs are first recorded in the early 13th century and belonged to the archbishops. And you can see here how the original marketplace was formed out of two converging streets, creating a funnel-shaped area immediately outside the entrance to the archbishop's manor house or hall to the northwest. Sherburn-in-Elmet was the centre for the administration of the archbishop's estates in Cawood, Bishopthorpe, Wistow and York. A medieval market was granted to the archbishop in 1222, and it may have occupied this small triangular space close to the site of the archbishop's manor house and next to the parish church. In the later Middle Ages, Sherburn may have grown. It had a significant population of innkeepers and artisans by 1377, and by then the archbishop's main residence had been relocated from the town centre to their hunting lodge at Rest Park, some 4 miles to the east of the town. It may have been at this point that new rows of burgage plots seem to have been laid out around a cross of streets lying to the east of the original market site and along the streets leading out towards this new residence. And certainly the names of those streets also suggest that they had a market function. So these non-minster towns of Otley and Sherburn-in-Elmet of the archbishops lack the distinctive morphological elements that were shared by Beverley, Ripon and Southwell, suggesting a very different impetus to their organisation. However, they had much in common with a very large number of other small market towns established between 1100 and 1300. Indeed, the funnel-shaped or triangular marketplace formed out of converging streets was much the most common form to be found across the region. Examples include Alnwick, and here you can see the pioneering piece of urban town analysis by Conzen on one side, clearly identifying the new triangular marketplace outside the castle, juxtaposed with the draft that I've already shown you from the forthcoming new historical towns map for Alnwick. This form was also found in towns now as different as those of Kirkby Stephen in Westmoreland and Newcastle upon Tyne in Northumberland, where I think the old market area is now one of the main nightclubbing areas of that city. In all these places and many more, such marketplaces were usually located at the entrance to the main landowning institution, whether castle or church, rather than adopting the bifocal arrangement we've seen in the minster towns. Now, it's true that there are a small number of other examples of rectangular markets inserted into towns in the 12th and 13th centuries. Leeds, Selby and Thirsk are all good examples. So the Archbishops' minster towns were not entirely unique in adopting this form, but it's nevertheless remarkable, I think, that they did all adopt it quite so consistently, given its relative rarity overall. In the case of Leeds and Selby, the rationale seems to have been somewhat similar. New rectangular marketplaces were established as new foci for commercial development at some distance from the mother church and the original settlement. In Thirsk, however, the new rectangular marketplace was laid out right in front of the main entrance to the castle to the west there, and not as a second focal point for the town. Although I don't have time now to explore all these examples further, I do hope that I've said at least enough to make the case for a comparative approach to urban development in the north of England, and to support my plea for more northern historic towns, maps and atlases. But before I finish, I want to ask, at least briefly, how we might bring these ideas about archiepiscopal town planning back to the city of York itself. York had a longer and much more complex history of evolution than any of the smaller minster towns, but it too was reorganised after the Norman conquest. Most of the Archbishop's estate near the minster was assigned to the canons, and houses for them sprang up in the streets around the cathedral during the 12th and 13th centuries. As in the smaller minster towns, there is also evidence of considerable replanning. In Minster's estates to the north of the Minster Close, a new suburb, Newbiggin, the same name as the new residential quarter in Beverley, was laid out with burgage plots. Closer to the city centre, a new rectilinear, indeed almost perfectly square marketplace was created in the 13th century, in addition to and at some distance from the older commercial centres around the Shambles and Coppergate. The archbishops may have played some part in these developments. They were certainly instrumental in endowing the canons with lands from their estates, including the laying out of Newbiggin as part of that process. They also fostered to some degree the emergence of a lay civic community in York, just as they did in other minster towns. However, in York after the conquest, royal government was a much more assertive presence than in the north's smaller minster towns. Much of the rebuilding of York in the later 11th and 12th centuries was a reflection of that royal power and of the influence of the new families of French nobles who were established in the city in the wake of the conquest. As a result, the development of the new marketplace took place within the King's Fee and under the management of civic authorities that increasingly answered to the Crown rather than to the archbishops. Nevertheless, it is of course possible that these developments in York were very much in the mind of those developing and planning the new bifocal settlements at Beverley, Ripon and Southwell. Of course, I have barely made it into the 14th century, which the title of this talk promised. All I will say is that it is one thing to speculate about the intentions and ambitions of archiepiscopal town planners, but another, of course, to consider what impact they actually had on urban life. In Southwell, on the right of your screen here, if the burgage was intended as a new market settlement, it seems never to have flourished as such. There are references in the 13th century to stalls and burgage plots in the burgage area, but also some indication that the burgage plots were being used for agriculture rather than for manufacturing and trade. Southwell, after all, lies just 7 miles from the much more successful town of Newark, which was located at an important intersection of the Great North Road and the River Trent. As a result, Southwell in the Middle Ages never really flourished as anything more than a very small town supporting its minster community. The burgage remained, it is thought, largely unoccupied and principally agricultural in its functions, while the main market space continued on its original site between the two short streets converging not far from the minster. The new marketplaces at Beverley and Ripon were, by contrast, a complete success. They grew and became the main centres of population in those towns, even if, particularly in the case of Beverley, population also grew beyond them around other features in the urban landscape. Already by the 13th century, they were losing their perfect rectangular outlines that were being eroded by infilling with both temporary and permanent rows of shops and stalls catering to different trades. All of this, of course, indicates a greater force in the development of medieval towns, the development of popular commerce, reflecting grassroots supply and demand, increasingly on an international scale. As we move into the 14th century, we see a decreasing emphasis on town planning as a means of shaping society and an increasing emphasis on the regulation of conduct. Often that shift towards regulating conduct is interpreted as an innovation, particularly after the impact of the plague in 1349 that seemed like a punishment for moral decline. However, if we trace the deeper roots of archiepiscopal engagement in the development, not only of their minster churches, but of the whole townscapes of their minster towns, we can interpret this emphasis on conduct more in terms of continuity than change. The same means addressed by rather different ends. Or should I say the same ends addressed by rather different means? I've got that the wrong way around, but you know what I mean. So throughout this talk, I have very deliberately not identified archbishops as individuals. The development of towns in this period were part of much broader cultural trends and ideas of urbanization that can be traced across the full extent of the Latin Christian world. On the one hand, but on the other only succeeded where they were embraced and peopled by local communities in response to their own needs. Individual archbishops sat somewhere in the middle of these forces, reflecting and responding as much as they were innovating and creating. In the end, we can only identify their distinctive contribution or the distinctive nature of either Northern England or even its individual towns through comparison, whether locally or ultimately transnationally. This indeed was the original goal of the International Historic Towns Atlas project, of which the UK branch is just one part. I hope that I've persuaded you that comparison is a good thing to do and that more historic towns trust maps and atlases will contribute to that greater goal. Thank you for listening to me, and please look forward to these new maps coming soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Sarah. Thank you for a wonderful lecture.